This is our first Ask the Experts for 2022, and I welcome everyone. Our previous Ask the Experts have been through all the different board committees, and we're now moving on to the nomination committee. It's a very important committee as it helps to balance the board. It looks at the assessment of the board members. It looks at succession planning, and it looks at the nominating, electing, and appointing of board members. Before we get into the thick of the discussion, I just want to remind all our participants, we welcome everyone to say hi and hello and a quick chat or some comments in our chat group. But when we get to the time for asking questions, I'd like to remind our participants to please post your questions in the Q&A. We will attempt to get to every single one of the questions, and if not, we do try and attempt to answer them after the session. All our participants have gained their experience over their career in all the positions that they've held. So any views or any information that they share with you now is gained over those many years of experience, and it isn't to be attributed to any particular position now that they hold. We have a great panel here. I'm going to start by introducing you to Ralph Patmore. Ralph has 27 years of board experience. He's also one of the IODSA's facilitators. Ralph served as an executive director at Group 5 before co-founding and listing Iliad Africa in 1998 and led the team as CEO for 10 years before retiring in 2008. Ralph serves on a number of boards as an independent non-executive director. He's held quite a few of these positions, but his current positions, there's 4 organizations, 3 of which are listed. He also provides advisory services to companies and mentoring. Ralph is also a chartered director of the IODSA. So great experience. Our second panelist, Mohammed Seedat, he's also one of us, also close to home for us. Mohammed is actually the chair of the IODSA board. He's an independent non-executive director, and he chairs our nominations committee. So he has great insights, is quite close to our organization. Mohammed also is the CEO of SmartRack Group and previously the vice president of the Durban Chamber of Commerce, as well as vice chairman of the South African Institute of Professional Accountants. He's also served previously as the lead independent director of the KZN Cricket Union and the CEO of the KZN Dolphins for a period. Kholeka Mzondeki has served as an independent non-executive director on boards of Baldwin Properties, Ranat, Nampak, Aven, and Telkom SA, and has over 20 years experience in governance and senior financial management. Kholeka served as a financial director and chief financial officer in various organizations, including a Fortune 500 company, 3M, before transitioning into a portfolio career. She was a finalist in the Nedbank BWA Businesswoman of the Year Awards and has served as an audit member of the UN World Food Programme on a pro bono basis. So as you can see, once again, we have a panel with great expertise and skills, and I look forward to hearing their insights on this particular topic. I like to start with ask the experts to see what are the challenges on whenever it's a particular committee, what are the challenges that they are currently facing? So this, I'm going to start in the same order, and I'm going to ask Ralph to please share your experiences and your thoughts of, well, at the moment, what are the challenges that you are experiencing in terms of the Nomco?
Good, thanks, Julie. Julie, I'm going to go back to something fairly fundamental, or seems fundamental, to most, but yet I see it as the underlying issue for nominations committees, and that is getting the right people onto the board. In order to do that, and I'm talking now about an existing board. When you start new, there's a process, and we'll get into that later, I'm sure. But we talk about board appraisal, and it tends to become a tick box exercise for a lot of non-executive and even executive directors, where it is the most fundamental thing that needs to be done in order to establish what the weaknesses are, what the shortcomings are at board level, at committee level so that one is able to address it and then go out and find the right expertise or that suit the company and the organization strategically, industry-wise, and everything else that moves forward. And if it's one, bit of input that I can give is board appraisal is absolutely critical. There are two methodologies, and we can also talk in more detail about that later, outside companies coming in to do it, or a self-evaluation. And a self-evaluation can suffice if everybody is open and honest. And that's what needs to be done, because you know what you're being exposed to around the board table. You know who's not prepared. You know who doesn't add any value. And those things need to be addressed and need to be focused. And I think, for me, that's the single biggest issue that most nomination committees face, is where do you start if you don't have the right information?
Kholeka, can I move on to you and ask you your thoughts on this question?
Did you say me or Mohammed?
I'm talking to you, Kholeka.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, Julie, and thanks for the audience for joining in. I would say, the world is changing so fast. And sometimes we underestimate the issue of diversity and inclusion. And for me, a board must just not be, these people have got experience, they are, because sometimes we assume that age comes with wisdom. Because remember, also, a board also needs people who are change agents. And therefore, my take is that we've reached a point where the old profile of a board member is actually long gone. We need to balance the board, especially when you're serving in a board that's in a fast-changing environment, technology. I always say in one of the boards to say how many of us are actively using Instagram, even Facebook, because that's where you know how the new things are coming, what's coming at you, and therefore you need to be relevant. And then, of course, as a woman, I'm quite passionate about, women empowerment. Women form more than 50% or so of the world population. And yet, it's an old song that we've been singing for years and years. And I think as a woman, my responsibility is to make sure that intentionally we are bringing in the diversity of women. Women, not just for the sake of women, but because of their experiences, we bring something new to bear. I must say, but in one of the companies that I serve, the CEO always says, I always ask my wife about a certain situation because women have got intuition. And that's part of the diversity that as women we bring. So I would say one of the challenges is also stereotyping and unconscious balance, especially towards women. Thank you.
Thanks, Kholeka. That's a good point. Unconscious bias about women. Mohammed, can I hear your thoughts on this?
No, thank you, Julie, and welcome to all the attendees. I think Ralph and Kholeka have made some valid points. But I think number one, starting at the basics, getting the right spread of skills and skills diversity on a board, and we talk about diversity in general, skills diversity, age diversity, gender diversity. So that's all in order, but you also need a culture fit. And I think when a nominations committee looks at incumbent members or new members. It has to be someone who understands or will be able to understand the culture, number one, of the board and the culture of the organization. I also think that, a nominations committee is not one-dimensional. It's not only about looking for new board members, in terms of succession, but also to deal with challenges or potential challenges with current board members. I often find, that they perhaps are board members. Ralph spoke earlier on people perhaps who are not prepared for board meetings or non-contributing. And I think it's a responsibility of the nominations committee to deal with those challenges head on, to counsel perhaps board members who are non-performing, to assess those board members, speaking to Ralph's point about, the important board appraisals, et cetera, that need to be done, to understand exactly where the board is. I also think, succession is very often something that's not spoken about or not be, overt. And I don't talk only about the succession of a chair of an organization. I also think about succession, for example, on an audit and risk committee. You may have a chair of an audit and risk committee whose term is almost coming to an end. Do we have enough depth of succession? Someone who has enough institutional knowledge to be able to take on that role, and that could be the same of a social and ethics committee or a remuneration committee. So I think it's about starting with the end in mind, but also dealing with challenges and potential challenges head on. Because very often the easier path to take to a non-contributing board member is perhaps to ignore it for a little and wait for that person's term to end. But I don't think that's doing justice to the organization, more than anything else. I think, everything else has been covered, by my fellow panelists. And perhaps there may be a few more comments that I make in the future. The one point I would like to make is nominations committees also need to assess workloads of board members, and that changes over time. So perhaps when you appoint a person to a board, they may have one or two board positions, for example. But as their term continues, they take on a few more board positions. And I think it's the responsibility, obviously, number one, of the individual to assess that, and we talk about that a lot, at the IOD. In terms of programs that are run, et cetera. But more than anything else, it's also for that nominations committee to assess workloads, because there's only so much a person can do, and that may start affecting performance of board members over time.
Okay, thanks, Mohammed. A question that often comes up on a few of the committees that I am sometimes sitting on is the technology knowledge of board members and how the technology expertise of board members. And this has come really to the forefront with the pandemic and how everything has gone, where we went quite rapidly into a more technologically, I won't say advanced way of working, but we definitely, everyone went online. And we've got a comment in the chat, in the comment section, which I'm just going to remind everyone to please pose your questions in the Q&A, but I'll quickly read this one out. Ian mentions that ITWeb had an article recently that stated, recent research by the IADSA indicates that the level of technology expertise on the board enabling them to challenge the ExCo's assumptions is lacking. How do you deal with that? Because that is something that comes up. We need more IT expertise on the board. Is that something that you agree with? And how do you get around that? If you in terms of how do you manage it at the Nomco level? Mohammed, you're on mute.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry about that. So I think that's an important consideration and an important question, but I also think it's very important for a nominations committee to understand whether you need a technology expert, and it could be, we're talking about technology specifically here, or it can be a service that can be outsourced of sorts or bought, if that makes sense. So if we were as a board, didn't have the highest technology expert, and I'm not using the right terminology here, but we could be trained in that, or we could outsource that service to understand it a little better for an organization. I think very often we try and pigeonhole people and say we need a marketing person. Do you actually need a marketing person, or do you need a service provider who can provide that marketing knowledge? And I use, a marketing example, and I think that can align to technology. So I think there needs to be a reasonable amount of technology knowledge, but I think that also about diversity of people that you may have on a board. You may have a technology expert, for example, on your board, but that person may not necessarily fit into the culture, or that person may only be a technology expert and may not understand the broader business landscape, for example.
Ralph, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm tending to go along the same lines. I think a board is there to bring, well, let me first start. I think in today's environment, and it goes back to what Kholeka said up front, I get very nervous sitting on a board where people are still asking for printed board packs to be delivered to their homes, because that fits that whole scenario of they haven't moved with the times, they're not in touch, they don't understand. So you have to be savvy when it comes to technology. You have to understand what's going on, whether it's social media, whether it's company artificial intelligence. You have to have a broad understanding. But I go along with the point that no board member is appointed as, for example, it's in the same category, a production expert, because we're a production company. You have to understand it, but you've got executives doing that. And if you need outside advice, you can pull in outside advice to be given. So again, you don't want 7 CAs as non-executive directors on your board, because you're going to get a very same thinking pattern. You don't want 7 engineers. You don't want 7 IT experts. It has to be a mix, and it's all about mixed exposure. But for me, business understanding is the critical element, and how technology applies to it, depending on the industry you're in. So it's going to have a different weighting, certainly, but I'm not a big fan in terms of saying we need an IT expert, therefore let's go and find one. I don't go along with that, because I think it's the same in production, the same in marketing, the same in whatever you do.
Kholeka, if you have anything to add, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to just jump onto our Q&A. Okay.
Well, I think this is where the mix comes in, because you find that some people are scared of technology, and therefore you need somebody who's brave. And remember, technology does not necessarily mean just an IT expert. You need somebody who understands, interlinkages of what technology can enable. Not necessarily, an IT expert as such, but somebody who can actually know what technology can enable in the company.
Thanks, Kholeka.
Julie, could I just one comment, because I think Kholeka used a word there which I think is absolutely 100% correct. Technology is an enabler. It enables you to do business better, faster, more information, everything else, and that's a non-negotiable. So I think one must not get caught up in, an IT expert, as it were, versus understanding what technology does for you as an enabler. There are companies where it's their core competence, but most businesses, it's an enabler.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks for that. There's a question I'd like to pose to Mohammed. Should the nominations committee be a permanent or an ad hoc committee?
That's an easy answer, Julie. It has to be a permanent committee. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever. Obviously, the regularity of meetings is not as regular as another committee, perhaps like an audit and risk committee, but it definitely has to be a permanent committee.
I do want to ask, for a small organization, say there's a small organization that doesn't have that many board members or doesn't have the capacity in terms of numbers, what would they do to create their version of a Nomco? I don't know. Ralph, do you have any insights on that? How would a small organization create a Nomco effect?
I think the fundamental about any committee, and I understand where Mohammed's coming from, saying it must be. We tend to get into the realm of, listed, whether it be small Altex companies, etc. And yes, it must be. But all your committees are formed, and I'm staying away from your social and ethics and which is a Companies Act requirement, or wherever else, if it is a requirement according to the Companies Act. But committees are there because the board can't cope with the workload. And the moment the board can't cope with the workload, you form a committee, which then has the ability to go deeper, harder, and to become more efficient and come back to the board with recommendations. So if you're a very small company, maybe you won't do it. Most companies that are getting smaller and don't have a separate, it's combined with the Remuneration Committee. But then bear in mind that the chair of the board, who normally would chair the Nominations Committee, should not be chairing the Remuneration Committee. But what gets done in those instances is you run through your remuneration items on the agenda. Then you move across to the Nomination Committee and the items there, and the chair would take over. You would swap chair for those two sessions. So smaller companies, very often it's combined into a Remuneration and Nominations Committee. If it was purely, the company was that small, I think the question would come back to, again, the loading of the board, whether it was a requirement or wasn't.
Thanks, Ralph. Kholeka, can I pose a question to you? What role does the shareholder play in the selection of directors, considering the Nomco is a subcommittee of the board? I think that's going to link in with your AGM, but I'll leave it for you to share your experience.
Yeah, remember that the board is there at the behest of shareholders to look after the company. And that's the fiduciary duty of the board, to have the best interests of the company at heart. So on behalf of the shareholders is then to say that these are the board members that we feel are best placed to take care of your company, because remember, the shareholders have put in money, they want their return. So these are the people that we have selected, because remember, shareholders, you can have one, or I don't know, PIC has got, how many shareholders. So you have to be pragmatic about, then the shareholders then give that responsibility of selecting the board of directors, which then they recommend at an AGM. It's not a fait accompli that because the nomination committee has chosen you as a director, you're going to necessarily be accepted. That's why you have a rotational basis. If the shareholders really feel that, no, this person either probably has a reputational issue, or they feel that they're really not performing. However, if you have a good board, a good nomination committee, you would hope that will not happen. It would really be in exceptional circumstances.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Okay, then leading on to the next question, which is kind of tied in there with, to what extent, if any, does the CEO have a say with regards to the selection of directors? Where would the CEO give his or her input, if any? Ralph, can I give that to you?
Yeah, sure. The CEO and let's say the CFO or any other executive director, I think what very often gets overlooked is that they're a board member. So they are there and they carry all the fiduciary duties, they carry all the liability, as do non-executive directors. So they need to be heard and they have a right to have an input. So I have no problem with that at all. When they move into the CE role, they leave the boardroom and they operate within the limits that are given to them via the levels of authority. So that's a job to run the business day to day. The moment they walk into the boardroom, and it's a difficult scenario because they wear two hats. They're reporting back to the board, but on the other hand, they have one vote like every other director. So if they are seeing shortcomings, if they do have, and that's why they're part of the review process, certainly wherever I'm involved, we listen to the CEO and input from other non-executive directors in terms of what their feelings are. They're part of the process. Maybe not the intense process up front, but certainly for ratification. So I think they should have an input, and we certainly listen to them wherever I'm involved.
Yeah, I would, if I can support that. I mean, imagine, because remember the CEO is actually part of the board as an executive. And I mean, imagine if you were to choose a board member that's actually an enemy to the CEO. So it's quite important that at least they have a view of who they're going to be working with. Not to say that they have got, you know, the ultimate say. So I would say yes, because at the end of the day, you are working like equals and colleagues and listening to each other. So you want a culture of, you know, congeality. Not that congeality says that you cannot oppose anything, but, you know, you want a healthy debating environment on the board.
Sandile, Mohammed, a question from Sandile. He's asking questions around the diversity of skills. How important is that a requirement for board composition? He says that he thinks that he was under the impression that it is very important. Maybe you can elaborate on the need for this diversity of skills. You mentioned in the opening that there should be a diversity of skills, experience, age, gender. If you could maybe just give your thoughts on that one, the diversity of skills.
I think it's a good question, Sandile. Diversity of skill is important, but I think we all know that skill is almost the base of where we start. I mean, we may start perhaps being defined as an accountant or an engineer or a doctor, for example. But I think more importantly thereafter, what's built on that is diversity of thought. And I think that's more important over time as opposed to diversity of skill, but respectful diversity of thought, and not diversity of thought for the sake of being contrary. You know, it's nice to have different opinions and different experiences of people that they may have experienced, you know, elsewhere in their career or their journey, and that brings a lot of value to the table. But I mean, can you imagine a board where everyone had diversity of thought? I mean, that could be problematic as well. And I think that's why it links into culture as well. So I think diversity of skill is important, but then built on that is diversity of thought, but the ability to constructively use that in the correct direction, if that makes sense. And most importantly, in a respectful approach. And that would ultimately lead, you know, to optimum board culture.
Thanks, Mohammed. Do state-owned enterprises, SOEs, have nomination committees, or do they simply follow the ruling party's nominations? That's a question posed by our audience. Anybody want to put their hand up and answer that one, or speak to that? Mohammed's a no. Ralph's face says a
I think,
no.
I'm looking at Kholeka because I think she's had experience on that. I know from the outside looking in, but I I'm not as intellect. She told me just now I'm old and that I'm not as beautiful. I picked that up and I wrote it down. And she also said that the guy asked his wife, well, obviously a guy asks his wife, when I'm at home, my wife's in charge. When I'm not at home, then I'm in charge. I mean, but
yeah. Well, on the SOE, I sit on the board of Telkom. So it's not, it's government owns about, 40 something percent. So I don't know if that qualifies it as an SOE in the proper understanding. But because Telkom is listed, I think it's differentiated. And therefore, Telkom follows JSE listing requirements. So we operate very much like a private company. But I know before I joined in 2012, I'm also becoming old now. In 2012, government, when I think they had more than 50% shareholding, they actually influenced who came onto the board. But when we actually started in 2012, and then Jabu Mabuza, bless his soul, he had leeway to appoint whoever he felt was appropriate, and I guess that's why Telkom has been touted as more of the successful SOE, because there is no influence in terms of how they appoint our board members. So no, I'm not a government appointed director. I'm not a cadre. I'm a private person who has been called onto the board for my own experience and qualifications.
Julie, could I make a comment? And I think it goes back to, I think we all know, that the minister has the final say at the end of the day, relative to the board. But what I always say to board members on these entities, you're carrying liability. So even if you may not have the last say, you have to participate. And if you have a problem with somebody, or you have a problem with an appointment, the board members need to stand up and engage. Whether they win or not is a totally separate scenario. But for your own peace of mind, you have to engage. You have to give feedback, and you have to participate, because most of the enabling acts say that you can make 1 or 2 recommendations to the minister for appointment. But if someone is just thrust on you and they don't perform, you have to stand up as a board. What it does do, though, it puts your job in danger. And I think that's something we were chatting about off air a little earlier, is that that's some of the biggest problems we have on boards, is that people are scared to lose their seats because of the income. And that then has a negative influence on their ability to operate or to constructively engage. But you're carrying a lot of liability, and you're relying on the people sitting around that board table to be doing their bit, to take the load off you as an individual, and you have to trust them, and you have to, if they're not doing their job, stand up and be counted constructively.
Yeah, what Ralph is saying is quite critical, especially in these days, when we've had a lot of corporate scandals. Personally, when I'm invited in the board, I will look and see who is on the board. Can I trust that these people have, do we have our backs? And I saw in one of the questions, the comments was that we actually need people who can be brave, And I always say you must have somebody who's very vocal on the board. Even somebody who's pedantic, because it also protects you as a director to say, hey, have we thought about everything, because it's your reputation.
Thanks, Kholeka. I see there's a great chat going on in the sidebar chat going on in the chat group. I'm glad to see, good to see that. Two aspects that I want to go into with the Nomco is their role in the evaluation process, as well as succession planning. And one of the questions, two of the questions that have come up here, one of the questions is succession planning is a critical function at all levels, including at board level. What practical steps can and should a nomination committee take to assessing growing and developing talent and ultimately a board succession plan? And as I understand it, it's not just the board succession, it's also the CEO, the roles like the CEO, that they also play a role in terms of succession planning. Anybody want to share their thoughts on that question?
Yeah, perhaps I can go into it. It's quite a quick answer, Julie. Is that I think we need to start with the end in mind. You know, as perhaps, I mean, I use a chair role, for example. As you know, as a person is appointed to chair, you need to start thinking about who the next chair is, or who the pool that you have of the next chair is, for example. And you know, with my introductory comments, it's exactly that. You need to talk about CEO succession. You need to be explicit about it, because everyone needs to know where they stand. Very often, we don't have the hard conversations that we need to have. And I think we need to start having those discussions early on, because I think we all know that time flies, and before you know what's what, you know, a 5-year contract is over, or a 3-year term is over. And you may well find that without, you know, planning this properly, you don't have a potential chair perhaps at a point for a specific subcommittee, or you don't have someone with enough institutional knowledge to be able to, you know, take on the role of the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee, for example. And I think a lot of work can be undone if we don't have that succession and institutional knowledge. And I'm sorry for repeating those words, but I'm a firm believer that we need to start, you know, we need to think about all sorts of computations and permutations. If a person is elected, what would happen? If a person isn't re-elected, what would happen? And I think we need to build in those contingency plans, because we've seen organizations where there's a change in leadership, for example, and you know, the company or entity stutters for a while before they regain that footing. And sometimes, you know, what happens in that period is irreversible in terms of damage.
Okay, thanks, Mohammed. So going on to the evaluation process, someone has asked, if the board tenure is 1 year, how often should board evaluation be done? And is it wise to have 1 year tenure board? I've seen this come up as a query within our own office, and it raises a lot of questions at such a short tenure when it comes to evaluations. Ralph, what are your thoughts on that?
I think if we start with King requirement, King suggests that we do it every 2nd year, which makes sense, because originally King 3 spoke of doing it every year. And, you know, by the time you've done it and reported it back to the board and sat down and said, what are we going to do with it? You're kind of 2 board meetings into the year, you've got 2 more, and then you're evaluating again. So 2 years makes a lot of sense in terms of evaluating a board. How deep do you go in evaluation of the board? You know, if you're going to have an outside party come in, you're going to be paying a lot of money to do it. A lot more than, you know, self-evaluation, but you don't need to do that sort of depth even every 2nd year. Self-evaluation in between can fill that gap, whether it's you've got to decide on the complexity of the board and all those things as well. So I don't think it's certainly not an annual thing. And I think it kind of fits into succession planning which is more than just how old is the individual, how long have they been on the board, are they going to be standing down? It's also what happens if the chair of the audit committee falls over tomorrow and has a heart attack and can't come to work the next day? What are the plans to continue going forward? Same with the CEO. Not a lot of companies can afford to have a shadow CEO walking around. But you have to know, and there's nothing wrong in an succession plan saying if something happens, we need to go outside and it's going to take us 6 months. Can the company survive for 6 months, that they don't fall over? Who's going to do what and why if it's an executive role? Who's going to pick up the reins if it's a non-executive chairman of audit committee, for example? So that suffices if you don't have everybody. So there are actually two things that you're doing. One, and particularly from an executive point of view, who's 1, 2, 3 years away from taking over, and what the hell are we doing with them to get them up to speed? And secondly, what happens tomorrow if there's an accident and the CEO falls over? Who's going to pick up the pieces? And you see when it isn't being done, because companies come out and say so-and-so has resigned. Well, we're going to think about this, and then they should instantaneously, who knows who's going to pick what up, because the succession plan is in place. And you can see when those gaps are there, that the board or the nomination committee recommendation to the board does not have things in place.
Thanks, Ralph. A quick question here. Is it a good idea to add the director's affairs, or the roles and their duties, to the Nomco? And what are the required or recommended skills thereof? I'm not sure if that's something that maybe Kholeka, you want to take. Is it a good idea to add the director's affairs or roles and duties to the Nomco? And what are the required recommended skills thereof? So I think the question is saying, what are the recommended skills of the directors, their roles and their duties, if I understand that question correctly?
Yeah, I think it's really a natural fit, because the nomination committee, if you may, is kind of the governance committee of the board. And therefore, part of their role is assessing whether, as a board, are you effective? So basically, you would need, the skills are really that of people skills, skills of identifying what is needed in terms of forming an effective board, and not so much that you need an accountant or you need an engineer. So it's somebody who's quite well-rounded and obviously a senior in their role. You wouldn't really put a junior board member into the nominations committee, and you'd rather put the older, more experienced members onto that committee. Also remember, committees are there to recommend, and it doesn't mean that recommendation will pull through. So if the rest of the board just feels like, no, we don't like the recommendation, it's within their role actually to challenge the committees, but you wouldn't want that to happen often, I guess.
Thanks, Kholeka. That was quite a broad question. And another question, and this is again, we can't ever forget our pandemic that we've just come out of, or in the middle of, or hopefully coming out of. When interviewing new directors during lockdown, what was your experience around virtual interviews versus the in-person interviews that used to take place pre-COVID? So, I mean, Mohammed, you go ahead. I can see you keen for that. You've obviously experienced that.
Yes, sure, Julie. I think it's challenging I'm a bit of an old school person where I like to shake a person's hand and look them in the eye, and understand, the non-verbal part of what a person may say. And that goes the other way around as well. It's also for the interviewee, if you want to call it that, to understand, the people interviewing them and understanding them a little better. So I think it's highly challenging, in recent times, of doing everything electronically. I don't think we had a choice. So, I'm quite certain that everyone did the best they could do under the circumstances. But I really don't think it's ideal. I don't think you get a feel for the person doesn't get a feel for you. And when I speak about you, I speak about the board or the nominations committee respectively. I don't think it's ideal at all.
Okay, thanks. It seems we have lost Ralph, but I'm sure he's going to join us in a second. Okay, Kholeka, here's a question for you. How widespread is the practice of combining the nominations and remuneration committees? And is it ideal? Ralph did mention earlier that if the chairman of the board can't chair the Remco committee, and so the question was then, can the chairman of the board chair or be a member of that committee if the Remco and the Nomco are combined?
Yeah, remember, I think, yeah, it is Ralph who talked about the size of the company. If the size of the company is too small to have two committees, it's quite common that, you combine the Remco and the nominations committee. I've been actually in that situation. So what would happen is that you would separate on your agenda Remco issues, then nominations issues. And then when you come to the Remco issues, the chair would step down as the chair, and then the Remco chair would chair that bit. So that's how you would play at it.
Julie, if maybe I could comment. And again, I think it was Kholeka was talking just before we came on air. Any board is only as good as their chair. If you've got a bad chairman, you've got a bad board. And that is absolutely critical, because it can go haywire. People talk when they shouldn't. Someone dominates meetings, and the chair needs to manage that. And in order to do that, I think it's important for chairs to lead that in-depth process of, it's just one portion of the nomination committee, but going through the process of engaging with future non-executive board members, because they are going to be chairing those members, managing those members during board meetings. So to have someone arrive on the board, if you chair of a board, to have someone arrive there that you don't know, you haven't engaged with, you've just had a name and a bit of a brief CV, I think is absolutely the wrong thing. And it's kind of planting a seed that something's going to go wrong. So, I think the chair has to chair the nominations portion of the meeting and be deeply involved.
Thanks, Ralph. Another question I have, to what extent does the nomination committee or the board deliberately consider creating opportunities or space for inexperienced or new directors to gain exposure and experience? To really sort of grow the talent pool and take them from when people are young and inexperienced and build them up. I mean, there is a lot to be said for learning, gaining experience on the job. Is that something you can do at board level, and do people create that opportunity? Do boards and nomination committees create that opportunity?
If I could go, Julie. So sorry, after you, Ralph. After you,
Ralph.
No.
You go ahead, Mohammed.
I think. Listen, it's a very, very good question, and I think there's a fine line between development and then, for want of a better word, obstruction at a point. You spoke about, just linking into an earlier question about tenure of board. for example, you can't have, in my opinion, someone who serves a 1-year term on a board, because it takes you 1 year, in my opinion, to understand an organization. And very early on, I think one of the mantras that someone told me about was, when you get to your first few board meetings, you keep quiet and you listen more than you talk. And that's just to get an understanding of the culture, and I use that word a lot, but the understanding of the culture and the understanding of the organization. But you can very well find that by appointing, in inverted commas, an inexperienced person, it may destruct the culture at that board, unless that person has the thirst to learn the organization and learn the culture, and to be able to take on knowledge from those who have a little more than them. And I say that respectfully. So I think there is a duty, but that person needs to be equipped and needs to be learning. I mean, you can't have someone coming onto a board who's inexperienced and then that person doesn't read their board pack, and something as simple as that. So I think there's a responsibility. It's not only the board's responsibility to bring on that so-called inexperienced director. I think there's a responsibility on both the board's part and the incumbent board members' part to kind of meet halfway in terms of learning on the incumbent's part, but also imparting knowledge on the board's part. So it's a very good question. It's something that nominations committees definitely need to consider, because in the world that we live in, we need that diversity that we talked about. We need, not to be ageist, but a young person, for example, comes with a different dynamic and understanding of what a customer may need, what a stakeholder may need. I mean, you look at an organization, for example, where the average age of the customer is 35, but the average age of a board member is 60. How can that board ever understand what the customer requires, and how can that board ever understand that business? But I also think so to summarize my answer, I think it's a meeting of minds, and it's a meeting of a line somewhere in between, rather than the board taking on, or the nominations committee taking on, the full responsibility of training this person. I also think that it's a basis of training. I mean, the person needs to have undergone, for example, some of the programs that the IOD has to get themselves to a stable point that they are then able to contribute, perhaps not with institutional knowledge, but with best practice and understanding.
Yeah, but also remember, if the board is following, diversity and inclusion, in its real meaning, and you have a young person who's never sat on a board, but actually they've got good experience, let's say in technology and and setting up companies. Remember, that is the skill that you want to bring onto the board, and the board has the responsibility of an induction. You do JSC listing requirements, and all of that. So we must be careful such that you don't create barriers, unnecessary barriers, because then, especially in South Africa, we will only end up with people like Ralph. If I can use Ralph's example, and then there is not enough diversity because others have had not an opportunity to actually be on boards. But it's more about what are they bringing in terms of the skills and experience, not so much that they know the JSC listing requirements. That can be acquired.
Thanks.
Julia, I think that's 100%. To say it another way, and I might be repeating what's being said, but I sometimes just see in the programs we run that the expectations of some people are, you know, I've been to university, I've qualified, I've now got a degree behind my name, I now want to be a non-executive director.
Yeah.
Well, they're not going to be a non-executive director. You have to understand business in the first instance. It doesn't mean you have to have been a CEO or you know, at the very top, but you have to have understood the practicalities of business, because when you're sitting in the boardroom, practicalities come in. There's the perfect way and there's the practical way of doing things. And you need that practical experience. You've got to do the hard yards. And I'm not saying 20 years or 30 years of it. It might be 5 years, 6 years, depending on where you are, what the experience you've had that brings you to that point. And then secondly, I would say you have to go and get some board experience, maybe pro bono, where you sit on an NGA or a charity, you know, as a trustee. Go and get that experience, because you're interacting with people. It's no longer a boss, superior, you know, subordinate relationship. You're now working with people. You have to respect each other, and you learn those things. So, you know, you can't just find yourself on Sasol's board because I have X, Y, or Z. Have you had that hands-on experience? Have you gone and got those basic exposures? It doesn't mean that, you know, a board won't appoint you because you haven't been on a listed entity. And I agree with the comment is those are the easy things to teach, because, you know, it's like IFRS. Maybe, I don't even think the chair of the audit committee understands IFRS, Mohammed might, but the rest of us don't. And that's why audit firms have technical departments who focus on IFRS. We will not understand IFRS to the nth degree sitting on an audit committee, but you must understand the fundamentals. So you can teach people those things, but you can't teach people the practicalities of business, what happens out there, and in the first instance, and secondly, the experience of sitting around a board table in, you know, the pro bono or charity or whatever, because there's a diverse views. How do you get over that? How do you interact with people? Those are critical elements to succeed as a board. The rest you can teach. I don't have a problem with the rest. Or go on a course, come with your BAD 4 and 5 or whatever it is, and you're at a starting point. At least you've been exposed. The rest will come naturally.
Thanks. And I think that speaks to one of the comments that said the importance of a well-established onboarding process, because that could possibly encourage boards to pick less experienced board members, as long as they have that minimum standard that you're sort of talking about now. They've got the practicality of business. They've cut their teeth. They've got some experience. Mohammed, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think, sorry, I put my hand up before Ralph made the comment, and I was going to say exactly the same thing or similar to what Ralph was saying. You know, to have someone come to or apply to be on a board or to come to a nominations committee, but not have that basic experience. And, you know, Ralph speaks well about the pro bono stuff. I mean, have you served on the governing body of the school where your parents, where your children are? Sorry.
I hope not your parents, Mohammed. Yeah.
Sorry, Ralph. Sorry. Where your body corporate, for example, because then it becomes the softer skills. Can you learn not to speak, speak over someone else? Do you know when to talk, when not to talk? When to make a point, because you may have a thought, but is it important enough that you make a point at that point, at that juncture in a meeting, or do you make your point at a later stage? I think those softer skills can only be learned from practical experience. And I often look, when people apply to be on boards and you look at their CVs or you look at their applications, and if they haven't bothered to volunteer for charities, PBOs, body corporates, school governing bodies, and they suddenly want to now become a director of Sasol, I mean, I think it's a bit unrealistic in terms of an expectation. So I totally support what Ralph has said. Let's start and build from a point, rather than having the expectation of going in right at the top.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks. Kholeka, you want to add something? You've put your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I remember when I started going on to the journey of being a non-exec. I was still serving as an FD, and I actually intentionally then joined the City of Johannesburg on the audit committee. I mean, the fees were probably like 1,000 rand. And for me, it wasn't about the fees. It was saying, let me learn about what does it take to be a director. I was quite cognizant that I couldn't just go up to be on a listed board. So we need to be realistic. I mean, sometimes you've got friends that, you know, because you're sitting on the board, they think you can just refer them. No, and it's also about fit. Are you gonna fit in the environment? Do you have the business savviness, you know, of sitting on a board? And it's not just that, you know, you've got a degree and you've worked for 30 years. So it's also a self-evaluation.
There's a question that's come up is, should the criteria for assessing and selecting board members be documented? And if so, where? A board charter, a Nomco terms of reference? That's quite a practical question. Ralph, do you want to take it?
Sorry, could I just miss the start of the question, Julie?
No problem. Should the criteria for assessing and selecting board members be documented, and if so, where? In a board charter or a Nomco terms of reference, or where?
No, the practical way that we do it, or wherever I'm involved, is one first sits down at the nomination committee and puts together the requirements. So having analyzed the performance of the board, of the committees and everything else, you see where the gaps are. And then you document whether it's a 10 or 10 point, for example. Let's just use that for ease. These are the 10 attributes we're looking for. And please, number one on those attributes should be time. The individual has the time to dedicate. But you put those attributes together, you generally run that past the whole board first to make sure that everyone's had a chance to put in, to say what about, and test the assumptions that you're going in on. And then having developed that, let's say a 10-point checklist, you then go out and start the process of looking for potential candidates. And they would be scored against the 10-point list that you've developed. And that, in essence, should cover everything that has been mentioned today: diversity, age, profile, culture. Does it fit the company, the businesses the company in? I mean, as a prime example, I always use it. If FNB came to me tomorrow and said to me, would I sit on their board, I would not go near it. Not because I don't want to walk around the streets of Joburg saying I'm a non-executive director of FNB, but I was never brought up in the banking business. I can sit at a dinner party and I can talk about futures and various other things because I know 3% of it, and the mates I hang out with only know 2%, so I sound intelligent. But I'm not brought up in the culture of banking. And if you go back so I would never go there because it's not in my DNA. If you go back to African Bank when it first went down, and I'm just giving what's been in the media, I've had no further insight, but 75% of the non-executive directors had no banking or financial services experience. So you have to start questioning how well they did in terms of the selection, because if you're sitting in that environment, you have to have exposure to that sort of industry. Or association with that type of industry. So those are the sorts of things that you would look at. You would also, on that list, if people have only had been on boards of Sasol and Anglo-American, and you're a small cap, you have to again turn around and say, are they suited? Yes, you know, they deal in different things, different exposures. You may have one, but don't have 7 who have been on Anglo-American coming into a small cap or an Altex company board, because they are very, very different in the way they operate.
Thanks. Okay, I think this might be a bit of a repetition of what you had earlier. So if there's anything else you want to add, please just add it now, or we can go on to the next question. We had a question coming in that's saying, can the board committee, like the People and Governance Committee in state-owned companies, ever be effective in dealing with the nomination and remuneration issues affecting the company, given that these issues are largely regulated in the public sector? Let's just think about that one for a second. Ralph?
The reality is, I think you do have a bigger problem, because, you know, they do set the parameters for board fees. They do set the parameters for levels of grades of people in the organization. So having said that, and I'm not close enough to be able to you know, give an expert comment, but it certainly seems to be changing. For better or for worse, because when I see, you know, some of the packages that SOE executives are earning, it sounds to me like it was out of kilter with what they had. So there may be, maybe someone has an influence and made it more competitive in terms of being able to get the right people into positions. But again, as a board member, you operating in the best interests of the entity. So even if you don't have the final say, I believe you have to sit down and justify the case if you think it's wrong, because you're there for the best interests of the entity. And therefore, if you think people are underpaid or should be paid more, you have to make a case and table it and have that discussion.
Thanks, Ralph. Kholeka, do you want to add anything there? I know we dealt with it a little bit earlier, similar.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know if the question is probably loaded by what's currently going on. You know, there's corruption. There's people with no good intent. And therefore we probably must separate those, because remember, a board of directors is there for governance. So whatever in SOE, you know, is promulgated, like the PFMA, for example, the private sector does not follow the PFMA, but the government organization follow PFMA. You know, that's why in a private company, you'll never see, well, wasteful expenditure as such, you know, in the financial statements. And therefore, the primary role of any board is to follow the rules that are in that company. If you've got influence in terms of saying, this actually doesn't work, it's about then tabling it. And then if you're dealing with rational people, rational processes, because I think sometimes in South Africa, that's the thing, politics come into play, and therefore rational thinking goes out the window. So I would also encourage people to read, you know, the Zondo Commission report. My goodness, some of the things that were happening there, it's just horrendous. And therefore SOEs now have a bad name. If people were doing what they were supposed to do, we would actually have a well-functioning country. So I think as a people, we also have to look inside of ourselves, look at, are we self-correcting as a people? If somebody asks, I know I'm going off course now, if somebody is asking you for a bribe, are you not contributing to the problem?
Thanks, Kholeka. Thanks a lot. For those audience members who take up Kholeka's recommendation and do read through the Zondo reports, And for those who don't have time or want to just get to the crux of it, you'll be glad to know that our next Ask the Experts is on the findings of the Zondo report on the 23rd of March. So save that date, little ad break there for our next Ask the Experts, and we've got a great panel for that too. Okay, back to today's topic though. Would the Nominations Committee be the structure best placed to interview independent committee members as in the Audit Committee? So I think what they're asking for is, can the Nomco people, would they be best placed to interview independent committee members for the Audit Committee? I think that's what that question is asking. Maybe they're asking whether they have the right, can determine the skills, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think, Julie, sorry, I'm just going to talk here, and Mohammed will shout at me later for interrupting and talking over him and saying I should have served on the school board and I would have understood. The reality is the Nomination Committee, again, doesn't mean that even if it's a 3-person committee, it doesn't mean that they've got all the skills. You can invite people onto that process. So if you're doing chairman of the Audit Committee, you better have the FD of the company involved in the process. You know, we even go as far as having input from the auditors to run. Have they got the technical skills, the basic understanding? So you can have as many invitees as you want to into the process. It's just that it's managed and it's driven by a committee that is focused and driving it to go through. Otherwise, it goes all over the place. So they are best placed, but it's how well they use the invitees.
Now, I want to circle back to something that we touched on earlier about the evaluation process. One of the roles of the Nomco is to consider the evaluation process and to, I think, to run with the process. Can you talk us through your experience of the evaluation processes that you've done with as a Nomco, and what do you do afterwards? What do you do with the findings? What do you do with those evaluations to make them effective? Where do you disclose them? And what's the most effective process with the evaluations?
Yeah, I think, somebody mentioned that the chairman is critical, because you could have a chairman who wants to suppress, issues. And therefore, if you have an open, transparent chairman who's going to lead the process and influence how the results are shared. I mean, each committee's chairman will share their results with their own members and have an open conversation to say, where do we actually need to fill in our gaps? I find that, every so often, you must actually have an outside facilitator who's gonna deal maybe with the issues that are an elephant in the room, or who's gonna pick up on nuances that maybe you are not picking up on. But I think the chair has to take the lead. It's gotta be brave, to see through all the fluff and actually say, we have a problem here.
Julia, I agree 100%. I think it's chair of the board and chairman of the committees to address underperforming individuals, or, for example, commentary on the board, which might turn around and say we're not spending enough time on strategic matters, but are getting pulled off into legal issues and various other things, and we're not really adding value. Sometimes it's just a wake-up call for the board to refocus. Sometimes it's a deep-seated issue. I've been through 2 instances, one individual non-exec, who in actual fact, it turned out, once it was addressed, is that he didn't have the time to serve on the board, but was almost embarrassed, and I don't know why, to have not come forward and said to us, guys, I don't have time, because he felt he was asked to join the board. and he didn't have the time. And when we eventually addressed it with him, he said, "Gee, fantastic, I really don't have the time, I'll stand down." On another occasion, it was the chair that we had the problem, which is a major issue, because the moment you got the chair as the problem, if it's not addressed, the chair and the non-execs start drifting apart. Executives pick it up in board meetings straight away, and you start having dysfunctional meetings. So the board then has to get together, the balance of the board, and address it directly. I think sometimes it's tough, and as Kholeka has mentioned, maybe the chair doesn't want to address it, but that's where the board's got to be supportive. Lead independence should be supporting the chair. If you need to talk to somebody, go in two of you, not one, because otherwise it could become they said, he said, she said, or whatever. Sit down, talk about the facts. We generally, if we do an assessment, anything that comes out below average or on average, if there's nothing below average, we'll deal with the average scores. Otherwise, if there's anything below average that's come out, we would address it instantly. The chair of the board or the committee would address that particular item straight away, and then report back to the committee and to the board, because if anything's below average, that number should go through to the board as well, to know that the audit committee is operating in this particular area below average. And they become those focus areas for the next year to fix. So it's just the process that one needs to work through, but you have to have people who are happy to engage the issue. I know I've spoken a lot about the person, but you never attack the individual, you attack the issue, and then it will come up, so then people are able to treat it with dignity and everything else.
That answers the question that came up about who the board members should turn to when those who are not contributing to discussions at meetings, and the chair turns a blind eye. So then you could go through your evaluation process and through the chair and the lead independent, the chair of the Nomco, if it's not the chairman, and the lead independent.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see there's a lot of people who want to keep going, circling back to the state-owned, the SOEs. Should a SOE, which is an agency of a department, have such a committee if it's a department that appoints board members? So it sounds like in this case, the department is able to appoint its own board members, and not the minister, in which case would you then suggest they have their own committee?
Julie, I'm still, again, and with the sake of repeating it, you're going to work with these people on the board. And if nominations go in that aren't up to scratch, yes, the department or the minister will make the appointment. But I think board members have to stand up and speak with one voice at the end of the day to say there's a problem. And it comes back to Kholeka's comment about dealing with rational people. There will be instances where you're just wasting your time because it is I'll call it a political appointment, if that's the right word for it. But then you have to look at yourself as an individual and say, am I prepared to sit on that board? Because there's only one thing that you've got in your life, and that's reputation. And if you sit on a dysfunctional board, and I've seen it firsthand, and it was actually not a nice situation to go through, where someone had sat there, been appointed on a private board, something broke in the press, you have to ask them to stand down because it affects the reputation of the company. So if you want to be a non-executive director, you have to protect your reputation. It's far bigger than anything else in your life. It's all you've got. So for all of those reasons, you've got to fight tooth and nail. And it's easier to say to somebody, we fought tooth and nail, and the moment they appointed that individual, I wasn't comfortable, I resigned and I stood down. Your reputation is intact.
Thanks, Ralph. when you're selecting non-executive directors, you have a selection criteria for director nominees. Is that something that should be assessed or reassessed and updated every year? Or is that something that you can keep going on year, as long as it's a sort of a benchmark of what you're looking for? How often, or when was the last time, or how often should the selection criteria for director nominees be reassessed and updated?
My view is it's a point in time. Sorry, Kholeka.
Yeah, I mean, it's situational. I've said before, I mean, things are moving so fast these days that maybe one time you appreciated having a bunch of accountants. The situation now have changed, and actually I read in somewhere that now in the UK they are moving into having HR skills, talent, because talent, there's a fight for talent. Before you wouldn't really go out and want an HR person, but now we are coming into that play. And actually, even as accountants, I've said before, I said you also have to make yourself relevant in terms of being well-rounded and not just a numbers and figures person, actually understanding business, having all the quotients of a well-rounded individual. Creativity is coming into play. Emotional intelligence is coming into play. It's not only about how clever are you, can you relate to people?
Thanks, Kholeka. I see now that we are getting a lot of sort of repeat questions of what has been asked already. One last question before we go to final thoughts from our panel members. If the shareholders are dragging their feet to fill vacancies on the board with the required skilled board members, as also recommended by an external board reviewer, can the nomination committee do anything to get the required board members added to the board?
Julie, in private practice, yeah, the board has the full right to appoint anyone to the board during the year between AGMs. That individual then that appointment then goes up for ratification at the next AGM, because they have to be approved by the shareholders. And I think that question came up a lot earlier. So 50+1% of the shareholders have to vote in favor of that individual sitting on the board. But the moment a gap comes up, the board must start the process of filling that vacancy. You know, when it gets to the audit committee, you have Company Act requirements in terms of filling it within, I'm going to be guessing again, I forget, I think it's 90 days that you have to do it. So there are requirements, but the board can make an appointment, but then it must go for ratification. And if I could just make another comment, which because I know you want to go on till 27 minutes past 5 and it's now 26 minutes, so you'll allow me 1 minute. But just somebody was talking about earlier, what do you do for, and Kholeka, I think, pointed out that it's the shareholders that actually make the final appointment and on rotation, or whether it be for ratification. If you have large shareholders, it actually makes a lot of good sense before an appointment is made to go and engage with large shareholders, to say, this is who we're looking to appoint, this is the reason, these are the skills, this is the criteria that we chose. And I'll give you an example that I went through, which actually opened my eyes at the time, is that we were looking for a chair of the audit committee for this particular board. I happened to chair that particular board at that point in time, listed entity. We interviewed someone that we really thought was good. And she had come out of a mining company, which 10 years prior to the interaction with us had gone through a couple of issues. And they had large American shareholders, and the American shareholders came out here and they looked at the issues, and their verdict was that she was actually at that point in time a little bit naive in terms of her CFO role. Now, bearing in mind, this is 10 years ago. We're now 10 years further down the road, and she's gained a lot of experience and grown. And we were quite impressed with what she had achieved, and we made the appointment. The moment, subject to ratification at the next AGM, which was 4 months down the road, but we didn't want to wait, so we announced the appointment. And the next day, as chair of the board, I got a call from 2 of the large asset managers in Cape Town. You better get down here, get on a flight, come down here, because we have a problem. And they were not interested in ratifying this appointment for reputational reasons. And I still to this day don't know exactly why and what and how. But they just said you can let it go, but understand in 3 months' time, when we get to the AGM, she will be voted off. Now, that's tremendously embarrassing. You've got to come back, go to the newly appointed chair of your audit committee, non-executive director, and say, this is the issue. You're welcome. We'll fly you down to chat to the guys. They don't want to see you, but we'll fly you down. You're going to get voted off. Now, your next question is, she said, well, I'll resign. I said, fine. What do you put out in the sense? I'm resigning because of workload. Well, I only got appointed 3 weeks ago. You know, that's not an option. So you can get yourself into a very difficult situation. So if there's anything that potentially is reputational, even if it's 15 years ago, I always say, go to your big shareholders, discuss it with them, say, this was our concern, we were happy for this and this reason, and share those instances with them, because otherwise it could become a very embarrassing scenario down the road.
Thanks for sharing that, Ralph. These are the kind of experiences we want to hear about, and the things that people have to deal with. Okay, so as we're closing off now, because I see we're going not round in circles with the questions, but a lot of repeats. Are there any final thoughts from our panelists? We've touched on things about the evaluation process, succession planning, the nominating, electing, and appointing of board members. I think that's everything on my list. Is there new appointments, anything like that? You've mentioned that, you know, people must gain their experience, sit on the boards of the school governing body, sit on the body corporate, get the experience and know what it's like to sit on a board before you try and aim high and go for a listed company. Is there anything else that you want to add to this? Any final thoughts before we log out?
From my side, I always say, even if you have to be the only one challenging a situation you're not comfortable, do it. And therefore, as a nominations committee, you've got to also understand the character of people that you are bringing on board. Integrity key, people who are going to do the right thing. They don't have their own interest or interest of government or whatever at heart, but they've got the interest of the company. And you can be sure that they're going to just do the right thing, no matter how uncomfortable it is.
Thanks, Kholeka. Ralph, would you like to share any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just along the same lines, because I just think it's so important is as directors, we're there for the best interests of the entity, and you have to stand up and challenge. And all I say is, you know, just to repeat again and never forget, if you're going to challenge something, do it constructively, challenge the issue, not the individual. And then I think you stand yourself, you stay on the higher ground. If other people want to get down into attacking individuals, don't go there. It's not the right place to be. Attack the issue, be open and honest about it, and then you'll find generally you'll get to the end goal.
Ralph, when you say challenge, do you mean the same as dissent, or challenge just the...
Oh, no, challenge. If you're uncomfortable with the decision, if you're uncomfortable with an appointment, if you're uncomfortable with the, you know, the list that's been created for these are the skills we need, and you feel you should have, you know, younger people on it or older or, you know, whatever it is, whatever you challenge, do it constructively. So it's impossible for everybody to agree on everything. So sometimes, and I think, you know, Mohammed brought that up a little bit earlier, sometimes it's not your place to say things because it has been discussed, the decision has been taken. Your decision is then, can you live with the decision? You've stood up, you've had your say, you've done it constructively, and sometimes you have to accept. If you can't accept what's being done, then you shouldn't be on the board. Because going down, you can't walk out a board meeting and say, that's the worst decision I've ever heard in my life. You have to be, you're a one team. So in the boardroom, be constructive, challenge whatever you don't agree with constructively, but never attack individuals in their personal makeup.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed, your final thoughts?
Sure, I think my fellow panelists have covered it well enough, Julie. I think there's been some great discussion, some great food for thought, and thank you so much for having us on this evening.
We've left a cliffhanger for somebody. Somebody wants to know, what did you end up doing in that case, Ralph, where you had the institutional investors having an issue with your appointment?
I actually had to sit with the particular lady involved, and we had, in fact, we had nearly a 2-hour discussion on it, and we finally agreed. And she said, "Well, look, it's pointless. It's more embarrassing to go to an AGM and be voted off, because then everybody's going to say to you, why did you get voted off? What's wrong?" Whereas if you resign, it's in your own hands. So we left it very bland in the announcement that she was standing down. And the feedback was we gave the feedback to the institutional investors that she chose the route of standing down, because I'm going to go into another point here. I actually get I quite enjoy this, get excited about it, but the reality is, you know, as the ANC always said, and I'm not waving a flag here, EFF, ANC or anything, I'm not even going anywhere near politics, but we serve at the pleasure of the shareholders. So if the shareholders don't want you, get off the board. Don't sit on the board. And she was very practical about it. She saw that she wasn't welcome. The shareholders didn't want her for whatever the basic reasons were, and we agreed she would stand down, which she duly did, and she was very brave in doing it, because it's not an easy situation to be in, and I don't think it was her fault. In some ways, we blamed ourselves on the board because we knew about the incident. And we should have, and that's what you learn as time goes by, is we should have gone engaged and just said, you guys have a problem. We know about it, but we're comfortable with it.
Thanks, Ralph. And a big thank you to all our panel members. Thank you for making the time to come and share with us your insights and your knowledge and your experience. And I want to thank all our panel members. I would also like to, all our audience members. I would like to hear from our audience members. I will share a slide in a second, and I would really like it if you could just click on the survey to give us feedback on this event. We always like to hear from our audience members. And I would like to remind you of something very important, of our next session, which will be on the Zondo findings. On the 23rd of March, we will have a great panel. It will be chair of the King Committee, a legal expert, and we would like, and our own CEO of the IOD will be in and talking about the findings of the Zondo Commission that have come out of the report. So I invite you to register for that when the link gets circulated. And I would also really appreciate it if you could give me your feedback by scanning the QR code and giving us your answers in a survey on the session before you leave. Thank you very much. Thank you again, our panel members. Thank you again, our participants. And we look forward to seeing you next month at the next Ask the Expert session. Thank you.